11 July 2015. Altiplano Federal Prison, Almoloya de Juarez, State of Mexico. The shower floor is slick with chlorine and cold water. A camera watches a concrete box. A guard glances away. A second too long. Footsteps, a rusted hinge. A man steps into the shower stall. He bends, not to pray, not to wash. The drain swallows the sound. The fluorescent light flickers once. Then his sandals are gone. His shadow is gone. His name becomes a rumor again. Alarms arrive late. Orders collide. Keys shake in panicked hands. In the control room, the feed shows a blank square of tile where the most hunted man in Mexico was supposed to be breathing. His disappearance is total, cleaner than a murder. They will blame a tunnel. But the unexpected cause is simpler and uglier. A deal inside his own organization was broken, and once that happened, the people closest to him began selling pieces of him back to the state, one quiet leak at a time. 22 February 2014. A modest resort hotel room in Mazatlan, Sinaloa. The man the world imagines as untouchable is found in ordinary light, in ordinary walls, captured at the end of what officials described as a sustained operation. No cathedral of violence, no cinematic shootout, just the quiet embarrassment of a kingpin reduced to a body in custody. And yet, that is how the legend grows, not from what he does, but from how many times the state must prove it can still reach him. The public sees the nickname, the folk narrative, the billionaire fugitive. The organization sees something colder, a leader whose freedom now depends on systems that can be bought, bent, or broken. In this world, myth is not decoration. Myth is armor. Behind the myth sits a tradesman of movement, routes, timing, air corridors, trusted hands. The file describes him first as a trafficker and air logistics expert before he becomes the name at the top. Under his leadership, the organization functions like an export company with an execution clause. Cocaine moved north in bulk. Heroin and methamphetamine produced, transported, distributed. Cash driven back across the border in heavy, silent loads. It is less a gang than a supply chain with a hierarchy. People who carry, people who count, people who decide who breathes tomorrow. His private rule is simple. Visibility is weakness. If the boss becomes a spectacle, everyone beneath him becomes a witness, and witnesses become inventory for the state. After the second escape, July 11, 2015, Altiplano, something changes. The man who survived on caution begins to negotiate with attention. Mexican officials would later describe a meeting in October 2015 in northern Durango state, arranged through actress Kate Del Castillo, where actor Sean Penn interviewed him. The government called it essential intelligence because authorities were following Guzmán's lawyer, and that path led into the meeting. Others framed the real failure as electronic carelessness. More calls, more messages, more points of contact that could be mapped. But inside the cartel, the damage is immediate and intimate. A boss who breaks his own rule, who invites a story, signals to his lieutenants that the old deal has changed. And when the deal changes, loyalty becomes a calculation. Men start saving themselves in advance. They do not need to betray him loudly. They only need to stop protecting him completely. The Sinaloa organization does not move like a gang. It moves like a machine with interchangeable parts. At the top sits the boss, the name that absorbs the blame and collects the tribute. Beneath him, a partner-rival structure where authority is shared, tested, and quietly negotiated. In the file, Guzmán's operation is described as part of the larger Sinaloa Cartel, led alongside Ismael Zambada Garcia, A. Mayo, a reminder that power at this level is rarely singular. Then come the route owners and logistics coordinators, the men who do not fire weapons but decide where tons of cocaine flow, where heroin and meth move, and where bulk currency returns. The State Department description reads like a shipping ledger. South America to Central America to Mexico. Distribution cells abroad. money moving back across the border. That is the machine's bloodstream. At street level are the enforcers, necessary, replaceable, loud. But the most dangerous layer is the quiet one. Lawyers, facilitators, protected intermediaries, the people who can become witnesses without ever looking like traitors. OCCRP reports that Jesus Vicente Zambada Niebla, a top member, cooperated after pleading guilty, cooperation that can reduce a sentence. In this ecosystem, betrayal is not emotional, it is contractual. The first debt is never written down. It is built into a door that opens when it should stay locked. 1999. Puente Grande Maximum Security Prison, Jalisco. A new vice director arrives, Damaso Lopez Núñez, el licenciado. The file doesn't begin with gunfire, it begins with access, with small permissions, with contraband that becomes routine, with the quiet construction of a private protection unit inside a public institution, men known, in whispers, as the Sinaloas. Guzmán does not buy loyalty with speeches, he buys it with a system of mutual crimes. Bribes routed correctly, officials compromised permanently, favors that can never be confessed. Lopez helps grease the prison's internal machinery, corrupting the right people, insulating the wrong ones, turning the state's own walls into a service. And then comes the payment that cannot be repaid in cash. January 2001. The escape. With complicity from federal officials, the most valuable prisoner becomes a free man again, and the man who helped engineer it is no longer an employee of the state. He is something else, a creditor. From that moment, every later favor is just interest. The file does not treat Mexico as a backdrop. It treats it as a pressure chamber. In 2006, President Felipe Calderón hands the lead role in the war on drugs to the armed forces, not because it is ideal, but because civilian law enforcement is described as insufficiently honest or professional to carry the weight. The military begins to capture and kill cartel capos, and the nation begins to absorb the costs. Deaths, corruption risks, desertions, and mounting allegations of human rights violations. Even the Supreme Court is pulled into the gravity of it, pushing cases involving crimes against civilians toward civil courts instead of sealed military tribunals. The war changes the armed forces by expanding their duties far beyond war. Customs, prisons, airports, elections, migration, even civic programs, roles that make the uniform visible in daily life and make the institution easier to stain. Now intercut to the operational reality, Reuters describes a government turning to elite Navy troops as cartel violence worsens, because the Navy's special forces, small size, and training are seen as more effective and less vulnerable to leaks than the Army or police. The same report frames the risk. The moment the Navy becomes central, it becomes a target for the same corruption that already infiltrated police and is creeping into parts of the Army. A captain admits the posture in one blunt line: they work alone, they do not trust the police. Even within the state, distrust becomes doctrine. This matters because the cartel is not merely fighting the government, it is studying the government's fractures. When the state concentrates sensitive raids in a narrow, vetted chain, every other institution becomes a softer door. Local police, municipal offices, prisons, procurement, records, phone companies, courthouses. The cartel does not need to defeat Marines in open combat. It only needs to ensure that the information feeding them is delayed, distorted, or sold. So politics enters the room as a silent negotiator. Reforms promised, morale managed, scandals contained, victories staged. The state wants proof of control. The cartel wants proof of immunity. And in that collision, the most valuable commodity is not cocaine. It is intelligence. Who is watched, who is protected, and who is about to be traded. The loud war is what the public remembers. Gunfire, raids, headlines. The quiet war is what ends bosses. After July 11, 2015, Guzmán is no longer merely a fugitive. He is an embarrassment attached to institutions, a stain that bleeds upward into the presidency, the justice ministry, the prison system, the armed forces. That kind of pressure changes how everyone behaves. On one side, the government narrows its circle, hunting for leaks. On the other, the cartel narrows its circle, hunting for weakness. And in the middle, a boss learns the most dangerous lesson of leadership. Your protection is leased, not owned. Inside the Sinaloa structure, the escape does not produce celebration. It produces audit-like suspicion. Who signed off on the money? Who handled the construction? Who paid the right officials? Who knew the exact measurements of a shower stall and the precise distance to an extraction point? The tunnel is engineering, but the tunnel is also a ledger. Somebody approved every step. Somebody is now exposed to every other step. That is where the betrayal seeds begin, not with a gun, but with internal accounting. Exhibit: Damaso Lopez Núñez, a man formed inside the prison system who becomes indispensable precisely because he understands institutions as mechanisms to be worked, not feared. Insight Crime describes how Lopez met Guzmán in Puente Grande, helped build corrupt control inside the prison, and helped him escape in January 2001, then rose as a right hand who coordinated major trafficking operations and enforcement teams afterward. That history is not loyalty, it is leverage. Now add the second exhibit, the Sons. Insight Crime reports that after the 2014 recapture, Guzmán's decision was to place trust in Lopez, and later a dispute ignited. Ivan and Alfredo pushing for money, assets, and position, Lopez refusing to concede, and an internal war taking shape as Guzmán's obvious weakness became undeniable. This is the quiet war. The succession struggle starts before the throne is empty. And then comes the third exhibit, communication. When Mexican officials describe following Guzmán's lawyer into the orbit of the October 2015 meeting, they are describing a modern betrayal mechanism. Proximity creates signals. Signals create maps. The cartel hears that message too. Every call becomes a liability. Every messenger becomes a potential witness. And once men believe the boss is generating heat they cannot afford, they begin selling him out the only way that keeps their hands clean. They stop catching the sparks before they reach the state. January 8, 2016. Los Mochis, Sinaloa. A safe house sits quiet enough to be mistaken for normal life. 2:14. A small surveillance chain tightens, not around the boss, but around the lawyer. The state follows the professional masks first, because masks have schedules, and schedules leave trails. Mexican officials will later say this was the path. They were tracking the lawyer, and it led them into the meeting orbit that produced actionable intelligence. The hunt is no longer man versus man, it is signal versus signal. 4:32. Marines arrive with the certainty of coordinates. The door becomes a border. Inside, violence detonates fast. 5 people die in the raid, the kind of number that tells you this was never going to end peacefully. 4:41. Guzmán slips into what he always trusted, the exit that isn't supposed to exist. A wardrobe, a mirror, a hidden stairwell, a tunnel, his signature move repeated like ritual. 6:08. The final betrayal mechanism clicks into place. The escape route is no longer a secret. Either it was learned, sold, or simply allowed to be learned. He is caught hours later on a nearby highway, proof that someone, somewhere, stopped absorbing risk on his behalf. The raid ends. The consequences begin. In the hours after January 8, 2016, the government does something it has learned to do in this war. It turns violence into a message. Officials walk journalists through the house in Los Mochis. They point at torn rooms. They point at blood. They point at the hidden wardrobe door that opens into the tunnel, not just to prove a capture, but to prove competence. President Enrique Peña Nieto praises the security forces on television and frames it as a national scoreboard. 98 of the 122 most dangerous criminals no longer pose a risk to society. The state needs the image of control as badly as the cartel needs the image of fear. But inside Sinaloa, the shockwave travels differently. A boss's recapture is not a funeral. It is an opening. The old internal deal fractures into competing claims. Who inherits routes? Who inherits protection networks? Who inherits the right to tax the pipeline? Insight Crime describes a dispute after Guzmán's 2014 recapture in which his sons, Ivan and Alfredo, are believed to have pushed for money, assets, and position, while Damaso Lopez Núñez refuses to concede, reading the moment as proof of their father's weakness and aligning with other forces to begin an internal war. The hierarchy does what it always does when the throne shakes. It resorts itself by survival, not by sentiment. Then comes the second, quieter aftershock: cooperation. OCCRP reports that Jesus Vicente Zambada Niebla, El Vicentillo, a top figure and the son of a cartel leader, had been cooperating with U.S. authorities after pleading guilty, with the possibility of sentence reduction tied to continued cooperation. That is how the organization is bled in modern times, not by one decisive raid, but by insiders who convert their proximity into bargaining power. The lieutenants do not need to turn in a dramatic moment. They only need to start trading details like currency, and the machine adapts. The State Department description reads like a reminder of scale: distribution beyond Mexico, routes outward, bulk currency moving back, an international system designed to survive the removal of one face. The predator loses a head and keeps hunting through its nerves. We return to the tile July 11, 2015, Altiplano Federal Prison, Almoloya de Juarez. The shower stall is still a small square of concrete. The fluorescent light still makes everything look sickly clean, and the detail that matters is still the same. A man did not escape from this place. He disappeared through it, because the prison was never the real wall. The wall was supposed to be the agreement around him, the human agreement, the kind that holds when steel does not. The public was told the story in engineering terms: a mile-long tunnel, rails, a modified motorcycle, lights, ventilation, an underground corridor that looked like infrastructure, not desperation. But infrastructure is not built by one fugitive. It is built by a supply chain of permission, a straight line of paid silence. The tunnel was not merely a method, it was a receipt, proof that organized crime can purchase the state's own geometry. And then the file answers the question it has been circling since the cold open. What deal did he break? Not a single promise spoken aloud, but the central rule of survival that kept his machine disciplined: invisibility. After the escape, the organization needed him to become quieter, smaller, less traceable. Instead, the hunt tightened around communications, intermediaries, and the very professional buffers that power relies on. Mexican officials described tracking his lawyer and being led into the orbit of the October meeting, an essential element, they said, in the chain that produced intelligence. Whether that meeting was the catalyst or merely one lead among hundreds, the effect inside the cartel was the same. The boss was generating heat that could not be contained. That is when lieutenants begin selling a man out without ever turning in public. They do it by degree, by omission, by letting a message travel one step farther than it should, by deciding in private that the boss is now a liability, an old asset whose upkeep is too expensive. The structure makes this rational. It is a confederation of operations and interests, not a family. And those interests survive by adaptation. Roots persist, faces change. Even U.S. authorities describe the Sinaloa apparatus as international in scale. Distribution networks, multi-ton shipments, bulk currency movement, built to keep functioning when one leader is removed. Politics, meanwhile, does what it always does in a cartel war. It converts violence into legitimacy and legitimacy into theater. Reuters describes why elite Navy forces were prized for sensitive raids: smaller, better trained, perceived as less vulnerable to leaks than other forces. That very logic is a confession. The state is fighting not only cartels, but its own porous institutions. The cartel understands that too. It does not need to defeat Mexico. It only needs to outlast Mexico's trust in itself. So the file closes where it opened, on an empty shower stall and a simple thesis. Organized crime is not held together by loyalty. It is held together by risk management. When the risk shifts, when the boss breaks the rule that protected everyone beneath him, the machine does what machines do. It reallocates. It discards. It survives. And the haunting part is not that Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán fell. It is how quietly the people closest to him learned to let him fall, one controlled leak at a time, until the tile was all that remained.